A train whistle pierced through the Colorado wilderness in October 1944, and 37 Japanese women stepped down onto frozen ground. They were teachers and nurses, their minds haunted by weeks of preparation for death. Every one of them had been told that Americans were savages who tortured and executed their captives without mercy. But when the guards appeared, they carried blankets instead of rifles, offering steaming bowls of soup and directing the women toward barracks with actual beds inside. The kindness was disorienting, wrong somehow, like stepping into a dream that couldn't possibly be real. Then Sergeant Morrison walked toward them with an announcement that would change everything. Starting Thursday evenings, he explained, prisoners could attend recreational film screenings in the mess hall. The women fell silent, their faces frozen in confusion. Movies? Inside a prison camp? It made no sense. It had to be some kind of trick, a psychological game designed to break them down. Kako watched Morrison's face carefully, searching for deception, but saw only honest earnestness in his eyes. She understood then that this wasn't torture disguised as hospitality. It was something far more dangerous, genuine kindness that threatened everything she thought she knew about the enemy. The train's final whistle had echoed across those mountains as the women descended onto the platform, their breath forming pale clouds in the cold October air. Keiko Tanaka had straightened her spine instinctively, a reflex from her teaching days that had kept her composed during the long weeks of preparation for this moment. Those weeks had been spent learning how to face death with dignity, convinced that American soldiers would break her before killing her. Instead, a young sergeant with warm eyes approached their group, his boots crunching through frost-covered ground. "Ladies," he said, "welcome to Camp Carson. I'm Sergeant Morrison." His voice carried the gentle tone of someone accustomed to speaking with frightened children, though these were grown women whose entire world had collapsed. Kako translated quietly for the others, her whispered Japanese barely rising above the mountain wind. She had hidden her English fluency from everyone, ashamed of speaking the enemy's language while her students lay buried beneath the rubble of their school. The shame sat heavy in her chest like a stone, pressing down with each breath. Morrison gestured toward guards holding thick woolen blankets. "You'll each receive bedding, a hot meal, and quarters assignment. Colonel Hayes wants to speak with you once you're settled in." The women exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for the trap to spring. But instead of shackles, they received blankets that smelled of mountain air and detergent. Instead of thin gruel, steaming bowls of vegetable soup arrived in their hands, served by guards who nodded with courtesy as they distributed the meal. Keiko found herself staring at the wooden spoon in her palm, its surface worn smooth by years of use. In all her preparation for death, no one had mentioned spoons. The barracks stretched before them like a small wooden village, each building identical but far less threatening than the concrete cells they had imagined. Inside, actual beds waited with mattresses and pillows that spoke of genuine consideration for human comfort. Mrs. Yamamoto, the eldest among them, sank onto her cot and touched the pillow as though it might dissolve beneath her fingers. "This is not what they told us," she whispered. Mrs. Sato, the former factory worker whose blunt manner had sustained their spirits during the journey, examined the clean sheets with the same skepticism she had once applied to machinery. This strange hospitality felt like a weapon designed to make them drop their guard. Colonel Hayes appeared as promised. His uniform was pressed sharp, but his face carried the exhaustion of a man who had witnessed too much war. He spoke slowly and deliberately, with Morrison translating sentence by sentence. "You will be treated according to Geneva Convention rules. You will receive food, medical care, and basic dignity. This camp operates under American military law, which means you are under our protection." Kako found herself translating before she could stop, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. The other women turned to her in surprise, none having known she understood English. Heat flooded her cheeks with shame, but she continued translating as the colonel outlined work assignments, meal times, ICs, and camp regulations. "You are prisoners of war," Hayes finished, "but you are also human beings. We will treat you as such." The colonel departed, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the fearful quiet they had carried on the train. This was the silence of women trying to reconcile everything they had been taught with the reality of wool blankets and hot soup. That evening, as Kako helped distribute bread, cheese, and more soup, she observed how the guards kept respectful distance. They were watchful but never menacing, professional but never cruel. One private, barely 18 years old, helped an elderly prisoner carry her meal tray without being asked. "They're trying to break us with kindness," Mrs. Sato muttered, though her voice lacked real conviction. Kako lay in her narrow bed that night, listening to mountain wind and the soft breathing of women who had expected to be dead by now. Through the small window, stars scattered across the Colorado sky in patterns she didn't recognize, so different from the constellations above her homeland. She thought of her students, of the classroom where she had taught English literature, of the cruel irony that her forbidden language had become her tool for survival. Tomorrow would bring new tests and new impossible choices between loyalty and humanity. But tonight, wrapped in an American blanket that smelled of mountain air, Kako allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. Thursday arrived with an announcement that rippled through the barracks like a stone dropped into still water. Sergeant Morrison stood in the doorway with morning light framing his earnest face. "Starting tonight, prisoners may attend recreational film screenings in the mess hall," he said. "Attendance is completely voluntary." Kako translated his words mechanically, but her mind reeled at the announcement. Movies? The women stared at Morrison as though he had just told them they could sprout wings and fly home. "It's a trap," Mrs. Sato declared in Japanese, her voice firm and certain. "They want to watch how we react or fill our minds with American propaganda." Mrs. Yamamoto nodded gravely in agreement. "We should avoid this entirely. Nothing good comes from accepting their entertainment." But as the day progressed, curiosity gnawed at them like hunger. During their afternoon work detail folding laundry in the camp facility, whispered conversations erupted in quiet corners. What kind of movies did Americans actually watch? Would they be forced to see burning Japanese cities? Would they watch footage celebrating American victories? Mary Chen, the young Chinese-American woman who operated the projection equipment, observed these quiet debates with growing interest. Her journal already contained careful observations about the Japanese women's daily routines, their quiet dignity, their obvious intelligence. When Morrison asked her to prepare the mess hall for the evening screening, she found herself hoping some of them would come. As twilight painted the mountains in shades of purple, only 12 women made their way to the mess hall. Kako walked among them, officially there to observe American psychological tactics, though secretly driven by a curiosity that reminded her of her teaching days when new books arrived at school. The other women moved like deer approaching a watering hole, alert and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. The mess hall had been transformed completely. Chairs arranged in neat rows faced a white sheet stretched across the far wall. Mary worked quietly at her projection equipment while Morrison checked the sound system. When he noticed the women filing in, he offered a simple nod of welcome and nothing more. The lights dimmed, and the projector's mechanical whir filled the silence. Then Bing Crosby's face appeared on the makeshift screen, his warm voice beginning to tell the story of a priest who brought music and joy to a struggling parish. Going My Way unfolded before them in black and white images that spoke of faith, community, and the transformative power of small kindnesses. Keiko found herself leaning forward as the fictional priest worked with difficult children, teaching them to sing, showing patience when others had given up. His gentle humor reminded her of her own classroom methods, how she had coaxed shy students to speak English by making them laugh first. When the choir began singing, Swinging on a Star, she noticed Mrs. Yamamoto humming quietly under her breath. The melody somehow universal, despite the foreign words. Mrs. Sato, who had declared the evening a complete waste of time, wiped her eyes during a scene where the old priest realized his life's work would continue through the younger man's compassion. These were not the blood-soaked war films they had expected, nor propaganda celebrating American superiority. This was simply a story about ordinary people finding hope in extraordinary circumstances. Mary watched everything from beside the projector, documenting in her mind how rigid postures gradually softened, how weathered faces showed wonder instead of suspicion. Even Kako, who had maintained perfect composure since arriving at camp, allowed her carefully constructed mask to slip as the story reached its gentle conclusion. When the credits rolled and the lights came up, Morrison approached the small group of women. His question was simple, delivered in the patient tone of a teacher. "Did you enjoy it?" Kako nodded before she could stop herself, the gesture as natural as breathing. "It was not what we expected," she began in English, then caught herself and switched to Japanese for the others' benefit. Morrison smiled, not with triumph or manipulation, but with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher who had successfully shared something beautiful with reluctant students. "Next Thursday we'll show a film about families waiting for loved ones to return from war," he said, as the women filed out into the cool night air. Their conversations were different from before, still subdued but tinged with something that might have been anticipation rather than dread. Kako walked slowly back to the barracks, Bing Crosby's gentle melodies still echoing in her mind. She had spent years teaching her students about American literature, explaining the cultural references and idioms that made English such a complex language. Tonight she had experienced something else entirely: American storytelling that transcended language barriers, speaking directly to the universal human need for hope and connection. In her narrow bed that night, Kako stared at the ceiling and wondered what other surprises awaited in this strange prison, where enemies offered not just blankets and soup, but glimpses into their hearts through the stories they chose to share. Word spread through the barracks like wildflower seeds carried on the wind. By the second Thursday, 23 women gathered in the mess hall, their curiosity finally overcoming their caution. Keiko noticed how they no longer huddled near the door like birds ready for flight, but chose seats with the deliberate care of people settling in for a proper evening's entertainment. The story of families torn apart by war struck deeper than anyone had anticipated. When Claudette Colbert struggled to hold her household together while her husband fought overseas, tears flowed freely down weathered cheeks. These women understood separation in their bones, understood the weight of managing alone while loved ones faced unknown dangers. The language barrier dissolved in the face of universal grief and hope. Mrs. Yamamoto wept openly during a scene where the mother read her husband's letters aloud, her own hands instinctively touching the hidden space beneath her blouse where she kept her son's final letter. The mess hall had transformed in ways that went beyond simple decoration. Mrs. Sato, who had kept her reservations carefully hidden during the first screening, found herself nodding earnestly when a teenage girl on screen complained about wartime shortages. Everyone in that room understood scarcity. They had all learned to make impossibly small portions stretch further, had all discovered creative ways to feed their families on next to nothing. Morrison had taken a calculated risk. Popcorn began appearing at the evening screenings, a small act of defiance against camp regulations. Mary became his silent partner, carefully noting the extra snacks in her weekly reports as supplemental evening rations. The other women had never encountered popcorn before. Most found the salty buttered kernels surprising, almost strange. But what mattered wasn't the snack itself. It was what it represented. He wasn't just showing them American films. He was sharing American moments, American rituals. He was treating them as guests rather than prisoners. By week 3, when the best years of our lives flickered across the makeshift screen, nearly all 37 women had gathered in the mess hall. Keiko had naturally become the bridge between worlds. She translated dialogue, explained cultural references that would otherwise have vanished meaninglessly into the air. When she clarified that a soda jerk was simply a young man working at an ice cream counter, not an insult at all, a ripple of quiet laughter moved through the group. Keiko and Morrison's growing friendship had developed quietly through these translations and their mutual passion for literature. During the day, when she cleaned offices in the administration building, he deliberately left books on his desk. Steinbeck, Hemingway, even Robert Frost's poetry. She would pause while working, drawn to passages she couldn't resist reading. Their brief conversations, when paths crossed in hallways, carried the warmth of genuine intellectual kinship beneath their formal reserve. Mary watched and documented everything in her journal. Former enemies were becoming real people before her eyes, individuals with separate identities, genuine hopes, authentic fears. She noted how Mrs. Tanaka, known as Keko, had become their unofficial bridge between cultures. She observed Mrs. Yamamoto humming songs from the films while she worked. Even stern Mrs. Sato had begun asking genuine questions about American customs and traditions. The social transformation fascinated Mary as much as it would have captivated any anthropologist witnessing such a remarkable human experiment unfold in real time. When Meet Me in St. Louis played in November, homesickness descended upon the room like morning fog rolling through a valley. Judy Garland's pure, sweet voice, singing "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," created a silence so absolute that even the mechanical hum of the projector seemed to fade into reverent quiet. These women hadn't glimpsed their homes in months. They held no certainty about when or even whether they would ever return. The song spoke directly to something universal in every human heart: the longing for home, for family gatherings, for the comfort of belonging. Keiko watched Mrs. Yamamoto's face intently. During the trolley scene, she saw something flicker across her fellow prisoner's features. Mrs. Yamamoto wasn't remembering American trolleys. She was remembering train journeys with her own students, visiting temples and gardens, hearing young voices filled with excitement as they planned small adventures together. The specific details differed, but the underlying emotion transcended all boundaries of culture and language. After each film ended, the women lingered deliberately, reluctant to leave. Conversations extended beyond simple plot discussion to deeper questions. How did American families mark their holidays? Why did young people court so openly? What exactly did people mean when they spoke of the American dream? Keiko found herself addressing questions she had never previously considered, forced to examine her own assumptions about the country that held them confined. Morrison began remaining after screenings, speaking with careful precision and clarity, while Keiko translated his words. His patience never appeared strained. His genuine curiosity about their perspectives seemed utterly authentic. When Mrs. Sato asked why American films consistently portrayed women as independent and capable, Claudette Colbert managing alone, Judy Garland standing against her family, Morrison explained that American women had worked in factories during the war years while their men fought overseas. They had contributed to the war effort in ways that had surprised even Americans themselves. Mary absorbed these exchanges with growing amazement. The mess hall had become something truly unprecedented. A neutral space where enemies studied each other not for advantage, but for genuine understanding. The movies functioned as shared texts, collective experiences that created a common language for connection across the vast distances created by war, culture, and language barriers. As November progressed and mountain air grew crisp with approaching winter, Thursday evenings had become the week's brightest moment. These evenings transformed from something to survive into something to anticipate with genuine hope. In the darkened mess hall, surrounded by flickering projected images and the warmth of shared stories, 37 Japanese women were discovering something profound. Their captors also understood love. They also experienced loss. They too carried fragile hope that tomorrow might bring something better than today. December arrived bringing snow that seemed to soften everything. White snow clung to the barracks like caps upon the mountain peaks visible in the distance. Frost traced delicate patterns across the mess hall windows like nature's own artwork. Morrison had been making careful arrangements for weeks, calling in favors, navigating military bureaucracy with the determination of someone who grasped that meaningful surprises sometimes required tremendous effort. Mary received word of a special delivery. A print of White Christmas had arrived, a film that wouldn't reach general theaters for another full year. Irving Berlin's newest musical, featuring Bing Crosby and Danny Kaye, had been made available for military screenings to boost troop morale. Morrison had somehow persuaded his superiors that prisoner morale deserved the same consideration. The mess hall underwent its most ambitious transformation yet. Paper snowflakes that both prisoners and several younger guards had crafted during evening hours dangled from ceiling beams. Garland made from evergreen branches gathered during work details decorated the walls, releasing the clean, crisp scent of pine into the air. Someone had strung lights around the makeshift screen, creating a warm glow that softened the stark military character of the room. Most remarkably, several guards had chosen to attend the Christmas Eve screening, not as supervisors, but as fellow spectators, seeking the comfort that shared stories provide. Private Johnson, the 18-year-old who had helped elderly Mrs. Watanabe with her meals, sat nervously in the back row. Corporal Martinez, whose legendary homesickness for New Mexico had become camp folklore, claimed a middle seat. Hot chocolate appeared as if by magic. Morrison's final gift to the evening. Mary suspected he had traded his own Christmas packages from home to make this possible, though he would never admit to such genuine sentiment. The sweet, warm beverages passed from hand to hand, creating a ritual of connection that transcended ordinary boundaries between captive and captor. When lights dimmed and Bing Crosby's familiar voice filled the room singing about dreaming of a white Christmas, reverent silence embraced everyone assembled. The story unfolded with two soldiers transformed into entertainers, discovering purpose and bringing joy to others, creating family from strangers, learning that home could exist anywhere people chose to care deeply for one another. Kiko translated not merely words but emotions, helping her fellow prisoners grasp the cultural meaning of Christmas traditions while recognizing themes of belonging and hope that belong to humanity itself. When film characters performed for homesick soldiers at a remote Vermont inn, the parallel struck everyone profoundly. Here stood displaced people finding warmth in the most unexpected circumstances. Mrs. Yamamoto hummed along to White Christmas without conscious awareness, somehow familiar despite foreign lyrics. Mrs. Sato laughed openly at Danny Kaye's physical comedy, her stern demeanor fracturing like spring ice. Even the guards surrendered to the story's gentle magic, young men far from their own families, seeing themselves reflected in soldiers seeking genuine connection. When characters reunited at the Vermont Inn, drawing together old friends scattered by war's demands, Private Johnson openly wiped his eyes. Corporal Martinez leaned forward, absorbed in a story that mirrored his own hunger for Albuquerque family gatherings. The mess hall had become unprecedented, a space where former enemies shared identical dreams, laughed at identical jokes, responded to identical hopes. As final credits rolled and Irving Berlin's music swelled one last moment, no one moved to depart. The spell felt precious beyond breaking, the moment felt too rare to abandon. Morrison stood slowly, clearing his throat with unusual nervousness. "Merry Christmas," he said simply, his words carrying authentic blessing rather than mere politeness. Keiko rose and bowed formally, then spoke in careful English that carried throughout the entire room. "Thank you for sharing your Christmas with us. In Japan, we say, kokoro kara arigato. Thank you from the heart." Paper snowflakes continued dancing in warm air, rising from the gathered crowd. For 2 hours on Christmas Eve 1944, there existed no war, no enemies, no barriers, only Irving Berlin's music and the radical act of human beings choosing to recognize each other's inherent worth and dignity. Outside, real snow had begun falling, blanketing Camp Carson in pristine white that made everything appear fresh and clean, as though the world itself offered the gift of new beginnings to anyone courageous enough to accept it. Colonel Brett arrived with the new year like a cold front descending across mountains, bringing rigid regulations, surprise inspections, and the absolute certainty that kindness represented weakness concealed as policy. A State Department inspector accompanied him, briefcase full of complaints from those who had reported the movie nights as enemy coddling. Washington demanded answers. The response came swiftly and without explanation. Morrison received orders to report to Brett's office on January 3rd. He emerged 20 minutes later with his face carefully blank, his recreation officer position terminated effective immediately. The projector used for screenings was confiscated as unauthorized equipment, despite Mary's passionate protests that it represented Morrison's personal property, purchased from his own savings during Denver leave. That afternoon, a memo appeared on barracks bulletin boards, typed in official language that transformed compassion into betrayal. All recreational activities between military personnel and enemy prisoners remain suspended pending security review. Fraternization with enemy combatants will result in disciplinary action, including possible court-martial. January settled into gray, pressing silence that seemed to accumulate against barracks walls like deep winter snow. The women returned to staring through frosted windows at barbed wire fences suddenly appearing more prominent, more permanent, more real. Thursday evenings transformed into the week's longest hours, empty spaces where anticipation had once thrived, now occupied by hollow echoes of what had vanished. Kiko stopped translating daily announcements, withdrawing into herself like flowers closing against winter's harshness. Books that Morrison had shared disappeared from his desk when he received reassignment to kitchen duty, replaced by regulation manuals and duty rosters speaking only military necessities language. Their friendship, built through shared literature and cultural exchange, had become another casualty of institutional suspicion and fear. Mary faced her own reckoning when fellow Chinese Americans questioned her loyalty for documenting prisoner stories with obvious sympathy. "Whose side are you on?" demanded her bunkmate, a second-generation immigrant from San Francisco whose family had faced FBI questioning after Pearl Harbor. "They're the enemy, not your subjects for some college assignment." That brief glimpse of shared humanity now felt like a cruel deception, a dream evaporated in morning's harsh light and political reality. Mrs. Yamamoto ceased humming movie songs while working, her silence profound as temple bells. Mrs. Sato's skepticism returned intensified. Her daily commentary shifted from grudging appreciation for unexpected decency to bitter commentary about American hypocrisy. Yet late one February evening, as Kiko performed cleaning duties in the administration building, Morrison appeared in the hallway like a ghost seeking absolution. He glanced nervously over his shoulder before approaching her mop bucket, his voice barely above whisper. "Can you write English? I mean, truly write it, not just speak it." Kiko nodded, confusion crossing her features at his strange urgency. "I want you to document their stories," he said, gesturing toward distant barracks. "Not for propaganda, not for military records. For history, so people will know what happened here, what remained possible between enemies who chose to stay human." She stared at this man risking court-martial simply by speaking with her, who had already surrendered his position for the crime of treating prisoners as people deserving dignity. "Why?" she whispered. Morrison remained quiet for a long moment, his hands working anxiously at his cap. "My brother died at Pearl Harbor. Tommy was 19, wanted to be a teacher like you. For months I wanted every Japanese person to suffer for what happened to him." His voice cracked slightly. "But Tommy wouldn't have wanted his death to transform me into someone incapable of seeing humanity in his enemies. He would have wanted his loss to mean something better than additional hatred." The words hung suspended between them in the empty hallway, weighted with choices that would define them both permanently. Kiko understood he was asking her to become keeper of stories that might otherwise disappear into classified files and forgotten records. She thought of her students, buried beneath their school's rubble, and wondered what they would have wanted their teacher to do with this unexpected opportunity to connect worlds separated by war and culture. "I will write them," she finally said, "but you must tell me your stories too. Americans have families, have dreams. We should understand this also." Morrison nodded solemnly. "Fair enough, but we have to be careful. If Brett discovers this..." He didn't need to finish. They both understood the consequences. As he disappeared into hallway shadows, Kiko grasped that their movie nights had concluded, but something different had started. A quieter rebellion, fought with written words instead of flickering films, preserving the radical truth that even during wartime, human beings could choose compassion over vengeance, understanding over hatred.